All right, y'all. Thank you all so much for coming this morning, bright and early. We'll just give people a moment to get settled, but we'll start here momentarily. Today's James Wilson from the University of Cambridge, and I'll be chairing the session with our distinguished panelists. Our first speaker is from Slant Books, Gregory Wolfe. Gregory Wolfe is a writer, teacher, editor, and publisher. In 1989, he founded Image, one of America's leading literary journals, which he edited for 30 years. He was also the founding director of the Seattle Pacific University MFA in Creative Writing program, which he led for over a decade. He is currently the publisher and editor of an indie press, Slant Books, whose authors include Rowan Williams, Paul Mariani, Aaron McGraw, Ron Hansen, Scott Cairns, Paula Huston, and Brett Lott. Wolfe's writing has appeared in numerous publications, including The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, First Things, Commonweal, and America. He has served as a judge for the National Book Awards, and his books include Beauty Will Save the World, Intruding Upon the Timeless, The Operation of Grace. He is married to the novelist Suzanne M. Wolfe. So, welcome, Gregory.
Thank you. I'm not sure what distinction got me listed here first. I'm not even alphabetically first, but I'll take it. I originally had listed that I was going to speak on the Norwegian Nobel laureate Jon Fosse, but then I realized there was an entire panel devoted to his work, so I decided that I would switch. But I did enjoy the fact that when I wrote a very short piece for the British Catholic Journal tablet on Jon Fosse, the big headline says, "The convert honored as this year's Nobel laureate is an adventurous choice." And then my photograph was right immediately to the right of that. I had just a little momentary frisson there when I saw that. I have several reasons for wanting to talk about Piranesi. I didn't really know if there was going to be any kind of thematic introduction this morning to really talk about this word transcendence, which is in the title. It's a word that I used a fair amount in my youth and has certainly been knocking around the world of literary criticism, particularly literary criticism as it intersects with issues of faith and religion. But part of my motivation this morning is to sort of, I guess I could subtitle my talk, Against Transcendence. And the reason why I say that is that the word seems to me so deeply saturated in the idea of some kind of rising above or launching upward away from, to transcend, to get out of. It just seems etymologically, historically, to be kind of deeply embedded with that kind of mentality, which is certainly one that has floated around the Western mind for millennia, for sure. But it also seems problematic to me in relationship to Christianity and certainly to Catholicism. I would prefer the word immanence to the word transcendence. Although I know immanence has itself been used pejoratively most of the time. Charles Taylor talks about the immanent frame, right? Immanent being just this worldly, not otherworldly. And yet, we're a sacramental faith as Catholics, right? And if transcendence is too much a kind of Platonic abstraction, a kind of launching away from the earthy reality of our lives, then I think it really does drift into a kind of vaporous abstraction and vagueness in a way that I think Catholicism is always concrete, sacramental, earthy. So I'm always skeptical about this term transcendence. And so another motive is that the author I want to discuss today is legitimately described as a fantasy writer. And fantasy as a genre is, of course, hugely popular. As a book publisher, I get more or less a book submission a day, and on any given day, it is very likely to be a book about dragons, elves, and dwarves. And if I never encounter a single dragon, elf, or dwarf the rest of my born days, I will die happy. And of course, that's a great testimony to the influence of Tolkien, and that's sort of wonderful, but there's been kind of a paralysis or kind of rigidity or sameness to the world of fantasy literature. And my author today speaks eloquently to the possibility of writing fantasy literature in a way that is innovative, unique, and takes a completely different approach. And then finally, I just love this book, and I really strongly urge you to consider reading it, or if you've read it, to reread it in the light of some of the discussion we might have today. Now, when I originally came up with my thesis for my talk, I thought I was being terribly original, and then I did a little bit of Googling and disabused myself. Because when I read Piranesi by Susannah Clarke, the author of the hugely famous Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I thought that I had discovered an aspect of her vision that seemed to come directly out of the writings of Owen Barfield, who many of you may know was a close friend of C.S. Lewis and was very much kind of on the outskirts of the group of inklings that included Lewis and Tolkien most prominently, but also figures like Charles Williams. And I just thought, this seems to be almost right out of Barfield's writing. And then I did this Googling, and I realized that I wasn't the first to discover this, and that the author herself had mentioned it in an extensive interview. Still, despite my lack of originality here, I do think this connection is really helpful to grasp and to get the most out of a book that is in some ways enigmatic and disconcerting. In fact, Paul Contino and I were talking last night about how difficult it is to orient yourself in terms of trying to understand what's going on in this narrative. And so hopefully I'll offer you a little bit of insight there. Though it received rave reviews when it came out, it's still a difficult book to parse. So here's some basic plot setups for this book. And I will not be giving you any spoilers. Pretty much anything I will say is discernible within the first 30 pages of the book. So, and by the way, just out of curiosity, how many of you have read it? John, I know, 1, 2. So almost half. So, okay, cool. Well, that's helpful. So the story opens with a narrator who is living in what he calls the house. And in the house are many mansions, you might say, many, many rooms, vestibules, some huge, some small, all of which have a kind of plethora of niches and plinths containing statues, classical type sculptures in marble. And they can represent many different things. They seem to be echoes of the Western tradition, but very few of them have a direct title that would say, oh, this is a Praxiteles or this is a Bernini. You don't quite get a one-on-one. It's not that direct, but there are a variety of different, you get the horned giants and you get the angel caught on a rose bush. And of course, most obviously for those of us who have read C.S. Lewis, you have the faun in the wood talking to the girl. So there's the immediate connection, literary connection to the Chronicles of Narnia and to the story there. And if that's taken into account, the relationship to the story of the magician's nephew will emerge as you think about the story in Piranesi. Below this main level are the tides, is the sea. And the sea washes into the rooms below. And the tides are predictable. And the narrator has intimately understood what all the tides are, when they come, even tides that have an 8-year cycle, you discover. And the tides bring in crustaceans that he eats and seaweed that he uses for food and for tying things together. And then the third level, the level on top, is the level of the clouds and the mists and the stars. So he lives in this kind of tripartite world, which of course is a very classical and ancient way of thinking of, we live in the Middle Earth here, below and above us are these other realms. And it's a world of kind of haunting beauty. It's cold and it's damp, but it's also bracing and mysterious and exciting. And enchanting, I think, in a way. I was immediately just sort of immersed in that world. But of course, very soon you're asking yourself, who is this guy? And why does he seem to live by himself in this strange world? And eventually he confesses that there is one other who lives, who is discernible in the house, and of course he calls this person the other. And when that other is introduced, we're immediately aware that this other has a very different attitude toward the house and toward the universe. And the other is a scientist, and the narrator considers themselves a scientist too, but you very clearly get the idea that they have two different priorities in life, two different ways of looking at the world. So, for example, the other believes that there is a great and secret knowledge hidden somewhere in the world that will grant us enormous powers when we have discovered it. This is right at the beginning of the book. And this is where I think the reader, again, will have some sense that there's something going on here beyond this immersed, ecstatic beauty of the narrator's world. There are 7 points to the other's ideas about what the great and secret knowledge hidden in the world is. And I'll just read them off quickly to you. 1, vanquishing death and becoming immortal. 2, learning by a process of telepathy what other people are thinking. 3, transforming ourselves into eagles and flying through the air. 4, transforming ourselves into fish and swimming through the tides. 5, moving objects using only our thoughts. 6, snuffing out and reigniting the sun and stars. And 7, dominating lesser intellects and bending them to our will. So this is something that the narrator, Piranesi, it first sort of says, oh, let's follow these scientific principles. I'm an explorer too. But eventually confesses that he can't abide these. These seem somehow wrong to him. Although he likes the idea of becoming an eagle or a fish. But the others he's not sure of, these domination dreams. And one of the things that really struck me, immediately upon reading this was that the nature of the consciousness of the narrator, of Piranesi himself, is odd, is not contemporary, is not recognizably everyday 21st century normal. And so what was striking to me about it was his sense of not being an observer, but a kind of participant in reality. And this goes back to Owen Barfield's ideas. And there's absolutely no way that I can recount Barfield's ideas about the evolution of consciousness in the allotted time that I have, other than to sort of promote the worth of investigating these. They certainly influenced C.S. Lewis. They influenced people as far afield as Saul Bellow, not a writer you'd think of as being in the kind of Lewis, Tolkien, Charles Williams mold. But Saul Bellow was deeply taken with Barfield's approach to things. Barfield, of course, also is a little suspect, I think would be the word, to a lot of Christians, because he was a big fan of anthroposophy and the thought of Rudolf Steiner, which certainly feels heretical or dangerous in some ways, occultish. And I get it. There's definitely reason to be, cautious in relation to these things. But I think that's led to too little attention to Barfield's thought, which I think is fundamental and chimes with many other 20th century thinkers. And I think even with some of Charles Taylor's recent writings, I think they would be very much in line with one another. And here's the short version, because I don't have much time left. Barfield talks about what he called the evolution of consciousness, that the way that we are situated in the cosmos, the way that our individual selves relate to the world has changed since ancient times. That the ancient world had what he called original participation, that there wasn't this sense in modernity that I am an observer of a separate external world to myself, that the scientific method hadn't yet made its way into people's thinking, that the ancient man saw themselves as a piece of reality. And here's a quote. For example, from Barfield, before the scientific revolution, man did not feel himself isolated by his skin from the world outside to quite the same extent that we do. He was integrated or mortised into it, each different part of him being united to a different part of it by some invisible thread. In his relation to his environment, the man of the Middle Ages was rather less like an island, rather more like an embryo. I love that image. And here's another Barfield quote. Before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment men wore about them than a stage on which they moved. And so his approach to this is to say, when the scientific revolution, when Descartes and modern man sort of separated us from the world, we became an I-it relationship. We're no longer participating in the cosmos as a unified part of it. And when that happened, we fell into what he calls idolatry. The idolatry of materiality, of quantification. And so when you see the contrast between the narrator's ecstatic relationship to the world and the other's desire for domination, you see these two ways of looking at the world, and you begin to realize that this narrator's character of Piranesi is somehow mysteriously been thrown into this participatory experience. So, for example, he talks to the birds, and he does other weird things that literally the author, Susannah Clarke, said she wanted to put us off kilter. So, for example, one thing he does is he discovers human remains in the different rooms, and he meticulously takes care of these bones that have been left behind, and he gathers them together and he puts them in safe places that won't get washed away by the tide. And, there's kind of something creepy about it in a way. Like a modern mind reading this is going to go, yeah, right? It's a little weird, it's a little strange. And so that talking to birds, meticulously taking care of the dead, talking to the dead, cherishing the dead in these ways, it's a little bit oddball. But I think it's very much Clarke's idea of original participation and a kind of deep sense of kind of mystical union with past, present, future, living, dead, still to come. Here's an example of one little beautiful image. He dates his little diary entries, by the way, not by a year, but by an event in his life, which again seems very concrete. So all these early entries, you'll see the date of entry for the 30th day of the 5th month in the year the albatross came to the southwestern halls. But here's the actual incident of albatross, and I'll finish up pretty much right up after that. So here's the albatross. I saw a vision. In the dim air above the gray waves hung a white, shining cross. Its whiteness was a blazing whiteness. It far outshone the wall of statues behind it. It was beautiful, but I did not understand it. The next moment brought enlightenment of a sort. It was not a cross at all, but something vast and white, which glided rapidly towards me on the wind. What could it be? It must be a bird, but if I could see it at such a great distance, then it must be a bird of much greater size than the birds that I was accustomed to. It swept on, coming directly towards me. I spread my arms in answer to its spread wings, as if I was going to embrace it. I spoke out loud, "Welcome, welcome, welcome," was what I think I meant to say. But the wind took my breath from me, and all I could manage was, "Come, come, come." The bird sailed across the heaving waves, never once beating its wings. So it arrives, and he thinks ecstatically that they're going to merge, that the bird's going to enter into him, and that together they will become an angel. And again, there's something quaint and slightly weird about this. And that's where the book kind of plays out the ambiguity of this character. And it's pretty classic, the idea of, is somebody spiritually insightful, mystically wise, or are they mad? Are they just plain nuts? And that ambiguity that plays out in the story, I think, helps to prevent it from being didactic or simply allegorical in some simple sense. You're made to feel uncomfortable. And that very lack of comfort, I think, is a provocation to ask yourself, what have we lost? What modes of consciousness have we lost? Are we so detached from the world that we don't see it as interpenetrated with grace, interpenetrated with beauty, interpenetrated with the divine? And that brings me back to my immanence theme again, to the world. It's not so much transcending the world as shifting our way of looking at it, of our perspective, of our way of seeing the ordinary, seeing the stuff of reality, which I think is a profoundly Catholic way of looking at things. So I do commend Piranesi to you. I do commend Owen Barfield's thought to you in books like Saving the Appearances and Poetic Diction. And as a beautiful little bonbon that the author has just added, she's just released a short story called The Wood at Midwinter, which is absolutely lovely. I think it's the perfect Christmas story, by the way, if you want to read it for yourself or read it out loud to your family. And I think she's really an amazing writer in the tradition of Lewis, Charles Williams, and the Inklings, who is worthy of our attention and our curiosity. So thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gregory. All right, our next speaker is Thomas Hibbs. Thomas Hibbs is currently J. Newton Razor Senior Professor of Philosophy at Baylor, where he is also Dean Emeritus, having served for 16 years as the inaugural Dean of the Honors College. At Baylor, he was also the inaugural Director of Baylor in Washington, D.C., where he currently runs a summer program on religion and social life. Hibbs has also published 8 books, the most recent of which is Theology of Creation, Ecology, Art, and Laudato Si, Notre Dame Press, 2023. He has written 3 books on Aquinas and 2 on film and philosophy. His most recent scholarly essay is Aquinas and Black Natural Law, Nova et Vetera, 2003. And today, Professor Hibbs will be speaking on Transcendence in the Poetry of William Everson. A little technical hiccup, which will be resolved shortly. So we're going to just change up the order, and we're going to have Professor Paul Contino. He's going to speak on Providence, Prudence, and Alyosha Karamazov. Paul Contino is Distinguished Professor of Great Books at Pepperdine University, where he has taught since 2002. and twice been granted the university's award for teaching excellence. Previously, he taught at Christ College and Valparaiso University. He's also served as Randall Professor of Christian Culture at Providence College. Paul and his wife, Mare Mullins, have co-edited the journal Christianity and Literature. He has published essays on Dante, Austin, and Alice McDermott. His book, Dostoevsky's Incarnational Realism, was a finalist for both the Lilly Network and CCL Book Awards and has been translated into Russian. So please welcome Professor Paul Contino.
Thank you. Okay, so here we go. I want to get this in 20 minutes. Providence, Prudence. And how many of you read Karamazov? All right, good. If you haven't, you know what to read. All right, Joseph Pieper, who comes up a lot in this conference, observed that the modern sense of prudence is far more akin to mere utility than to the ideal of nobility. It carries the connotation of timorous, small-minded self-preservation, a rather selfish concern with oneself. Some of you may remember Dana Carvey, wouldn't be prudent. Okay, maybe not. Like Pieper, I believe this understanding is a great loss. In its old sense, prudence is the indispensable virtue. In the midst of complex circumstances, prudence helps a person to determine the proper means to achieve the good. For the Christian, charity molds prudence itself, lends it a transcendent dimension so that it participates by grace in the life of the Trinitarian God. In his final novel, Dostoevsky retrieves and represents this deeper sense of prudence, ever ancient, ever new, in his depiction of Alyosha Karamazov. In Alyosha, we can discern the etymological link between prudentia and providentia, human and divine foresight. In Alyosha's slow work of self-forgetful active love, his human prudence grows receptively attuned to divine providence. Active love, prudently practiced, emerges as the seed that falls to the ground and bears much fruit. Alyosha's beloved mentor, the elder Zosima, says that active love enables a person to behold clearly the miraculous power of the Lord, who has been all the time loving and mysteriously guiding you. In the novel's two climactic moments, his vision of Cana of Galilee, and 3 months later, his speech at the stone, we see the cooperative, incarnational relation between providence and prudence. Part 1, Cana. The day of Zosima's death is one of the bitterest of Alyosha's life. He doesn't so much expect the miracle, expected, even demanded by others, but rather they expect the miraculous preservation of the elder's corpse, but rather he never expects that the man he loved above everything on earth should be put to shame and humiliated. Others gloat over the stink emitted by Zosima's corpse, and Alyosha asks bitterly, where is the finger of providence? Why did providence hide its face at the most critical moment, as though voluntarily submitting to the blind, dumb, pitiless laws of nature? A vague but evil impression left by his brother Ivan the day before suddenly revived in his soul and forced its way to the surface. Ivan had rejected God's providence. Famously, he returns his ticket to any divine harmony founded upon a child's tears. Now Alyosha passes through his own brief but lacerating rebellion. He too would return his ticket as he allows himself to be led to Grushenka's, where he expects to be seduced. Ironically, she proves to be the means for Alyosha's purification and his recovery of genuine prudence. Upon their arrival, Grushenka proves unexpectedly genuine. Her flirtatious welcome is in character, but Alyosha quickly discerns her kindness and thus exercises a key dimension of prudence, solertia, an alert openness in the face of the unexpected. Pieper clarifies this concept by calling it a perfected ability, by virtue of which a person, when confronted with a sudden event, does not close his eyes by reflex and then blindly, though perhaps boisterously, take random action. Rather, with the aid of solertia, he can swiftly, but with open eyes, clear-eyed vision, decide for the good. avoiding the pitfalls of injustice, cowardice, and intemperance. Without this virtue of objectivity and unexpected situations, perfect prudence is impossible. Throughout Book 7, forms of the word expected or unexpected appear over 20 times. Forms of the word surprise over 10. Unexpectedly, Zosima has been humiliated. The image of Grushenka, the woman he most feared, also emerges unexpectedly as Christ-like. In the course of this harrowing, ultimately rapturous day, Alyosha's faith matures as it grows more receptive to reality in all its reversals. Grushenka manifests her goodness and beauty in her attention to Alyosha, most luminously when she learns of Zosima's death. I'll read the passage. "Good God, I didn't know," she crossed herself devoutly. "Goodness, what have I been doing, sitting on his knee here like that at this moment?" She started up as though in dismay, instantly slipped off his knee and sat down on the sofa. Alyosha fixed a long, wondering look upon her. And a light seemed to dawn on his face. "Rakitin," he said suddenly in a firm, loud voice, "don't taunt me for having rebelled against God. I don't want to feel angry with you, so you must be kinder too. I've lost a treasure such as you've never had, and you can't judge me now. I came here to find a wicked soul. I felt drawn to evil because I was base and evil myself, but I've found a true sister. I have found a treasure, a loving heart. You had pity on me just now." He uses her formal name, Agrafena Alexandrovna. "I'm speaking of you. You've raised my soul from the depths." Providence hasn't hidden its face, but revealed it in Grushenka's. Alyosha's prudential receptivity allows him to receive this gift. In the chapter that follows, Cana of Galilee, he returns to the monastery, falls asleep next to Zosima's coffin, and has a dream that's a bit like the end of Paradiso, Dante, another writer who comes up a lot. Alyosha arrives a little after 9 p.m. As in Dante, triads matter. Zosima's shaming culminates at about 3 p.m., the hour of Christ's death. Now at 9 p.m., Alyosha witnesses Christ's resurrected life. Read in the light of Paradiso's slow and calm rotation of impressions within Alyosha's soul, the sweetness in his heart, the joy singing in his mind, one recalls Dante, whose own soul rotates like wheels revolving with an even motion by the love that moves the sun and other stars. Alyosha falls before the coffin as if it were a holy thing, made sacramental by the presence of the man who lies within. Alyosha loves the story of Cana, here read aloud by Father Pazzi. Cana's is the miracle that Jesus never expected to perform. Just as Alyosha never expected the miracle that has transpired with Grushenka. Both miracles are gratuitous and purposeful. In his vision, Alyosha experiences the wholeness of things. Once the water is made wine, he feels the walls of the room opening out. To his surprise, he sees Zosima at the wedding feast, now become a heavenly banquet, over which the transfigured, risen Christ presides. Dostoevsky's incarnational, both and imagination is here clearly to be discerned in three ways. First, Christ is presented as both immanent and transcendent. Zosima exhorts Alyosha to look at the image of the risen Christ. "Our son, do you see him?" Earlier, Zosima had insisted if we did not have the precious image of Christ before us, we would perish and be altogether lost. Now he affirms the paradoxical power of that image, which includes the transcendent. Awful is his greatness before us. He became like us out of love, and now is rejoicing, transforming water into wine, that the joy of his guests may not end. Secondly, Alyosha and his emotional state is marked by joy and pain. Something burned in his heart, suddenly filled him almost painfully. Tears of rapture burst in his soul. Third, as he awakens and gazes for 30 seconds upon Zosima's body, he sees his friend as both dead and risen. His voice was still resounding in his ears. Here the symphonic chapter reaches its final movement. Yearning for freedom, space, and vastness, Alyosha hurries outside. In the starlit August night, we discern three more both and movements. First, he perceives the nuptial union of infinite and finite, the way seeds from other worlds sprout on earth, how all thus lives and grows only through its sense of being in touch with other mysterious worlds. He sees shining stars, golden domes, sleeping flowers, and he hears the silence of the earth merging with the silence of the heavens, the mystery of the earth touching the mystery of the stars. Second, like Zosima, he descends and ascends. A profound impulse of loving memory propels him to fall upon the feminine earth. In an open arm gesture, much like the one that Greg was describing, a profound impulse of loving memory propels him upon the feminine earth and suggests both eros, he longs to kiss and kiss all of it, and agape, he wanted to forgive everyone. The synthesis of eros and agape, as Benedict XVI reminded us, is caritas. Third and finally, Alyosha experience is both solitary and communal. No one observes his ecstasy. Alone on the earth, he weeps for his fellow creatures. He wanted to forgive everyone, everything, and to ask forgiveness. Oh, not for himself, but for all and for everything, as others are asking for me, he thinks. I believe the phrase "for all" provides the linguistic key to the novel. Its incantatory repetitions forge a both and unity that suggests both that divine grace is given for all and that we are responsible for all. For all links the dual claims of the Christian life, the gift received as task. Christ redeems all, we must work responsibly for all. And that phrase is drawn from the Eucharistic prayer in the Orthodox liturgy, in behalf of all, for all, as is the phrase from ages to ages. Alyosha's mystical moment in solitude is situated in the communal center context of the church, and so too his final task as a monk in the world, his speech at the stone. That's part two. Today we celebrate All Saints, tomorrow All Souls Day, days in which we remember, pray to, and for loved ones who have died, saints and sinners, whom we hope someday to rejoin in communal beatitude. Alyosha's speech can be read as an act of liturgical, Eucharistic remembrance. He has reconciled a group of 12 boys with Alyosha, the boy who has just died, and the boys depart the funeral liturgy. And one of the boys, Smirov, sees the stone by which the little boy who died, Ilyusha, asked to be buried. There's Ilyusha's stone, he says. Now, moments earlier, this little boy, Smirov, had snatched up a piece of red brick and threw it at the birds, the flock of sparrows flying by. He's anguished, he's grieving, he's angry. He tearfully throws the stone at the sparrows that would feed upon little Ilyusha's grave. Is there providence in the fall of the sparrow named Alyosha? Yes, if providence is understood as Christ's invitation to participate prudentially in his salvific suffering. In his final appearance in the novel, little Alyosha had suggested this himself as he emerged as an image of Christ. So go back 5 days. Here's the deathbed scene of Alyosha. The sick boy is holding Kolya's hand, calling his father. A minute later, the captain comes back. Papa, Papa, come back. Alyosha faltered in violent excitement, but apparently unable to go on. He flung his wasted arms around Papa and Kolya, united them in one embrace, hugged them as tightly as he could. The captain shook with sobs. Kolya's lips and chin twitched. And the tableau is heartbreaking, but through her tears, the reader may discern an image of the Trinity, Father, Son, spirited friend, lovingly bound in a kenosis of sorrow, participating in the triune life of love. Alyosha had beheld that image. It has entered his heart like a seed, and it bears fruit in the final pages. Here, Alyosha founds a church, a little church of 12 upon a rock, Alyosha's stone. But, as Robin Miller rightly observes, I got 5 minutes left. What she actually says is their brotherhood is cemented by the very mortar that Ivan had eloquently refused to accept, the unjustified suffering of a child. This is very important. Is Dostoevsky ending his novel with an image of heavenly harmony built upon the tears of a child? Has he accepted Ivan's non-Euclidean theodicy? No. The novel's final image of communal harmony doesn't reflect theodicy, one which both Ivan and Alyosha had rightly rejected. Alyosha's suffering and death and the promise of his resurrection finds meaning in a more ancient and eternal understanding of suffering, one grounded in scripture and tradition, founded upon the faith that a human person is invited to participate in the paschal mystery of Christ's salvation. St. Paul exhorts his Philippian readers to make their minds like that of Christ, who canonically accepted our human condition, childhood, suffering, death, and eventual resurrection. Providence invites participation. Providence is founded upon the hidden ground of love that is Christ. As Alyosha had reminded Ivan, there is a being. He can forgive everything and for all, because he gave his innocent blood for all and everything. You've forgotten him, Alyosha says. In the speech at the stone, we may discern an image of what Khaled Anatolios calls deification through the cross. If the Trinity participates in the Mysterium Pascal, so too do we as persons created in the image and likeness of the Trinity. Prudently, Alyosha responds to Smirov's exclamation, "Here's Alyosha's stone under which they wanted to bury him," with an improvisational liturgy. His words comprise the novel's second climax. In Cana, someone visited Alyosha's soul. Here, something seemed to shake in his soul. In both events, he receives a gift from another, transcendent yet immanent. And Pieper notes that Christian prudence means the inclusion of new and invisible realities within the determinants of our decision. Zosima calls it a precious mystic sense of our living bond with the other world. This higher heavenly world raises humans from the earth, the humus from which we're made, into which Alyosha has been buried. I'm going to skip my Eucharistic, well, should I or shouldn't I? I want to leave time for William Everson, so let me just read the end. Alyosha's speech, and you know it, the speech at the stone. Somebody once quipped at Notre Dame, this is like the most quoted speech at graduation ceremonies, but it's beautiful and it's not sentimental. And it models, I think Alyosha models a poised readiness in the face of the unexpected. The boys bend their attentive, expectant eyes upon him. He sees they're ready to promise that they'll never forget how good it was to be here. And his speech is infused with the promise of resurrection. Karamazov, Kolya asks, can it really be true what religion says, that we shall all rise from the dead and live and see each other again? Certainly we shall rise again. Certainly we shall, Alyosha cried joyfully, half ecstatic. Oh, how good it will be, says Kolya. At this point, readers may find themselves echoing Kolya's exclamation. Dostoevsky wrote with the hope of such a response. This is my conclusion. The attentive reader will hear ways in which the chimes of the chapter inspire a sense of cosmic wholeness. Here, too, the commedia comes to mind. Dante discerns an eternal light, and in its depth, gathered and bound by love in a single volume, all we have found on single pages scattered throughout our world. From the start, the narrator promised that Alyosha carries within himself the heart of the whole, that which has been torn as if by a gust of wind. At the novel's end, and I'm going to make reference now to things you may remember, all that has been scattered over the course of 800 pages is united. Snigirov's troubled rubles, Mitya's ragged pouch, Smerdykov's Isaac the Syrian. All the lacerating losses are recovered and remembered by love. Zosima has promised that the practice of active love will foster faith in the resurrection, and here the active love of Alyosha and the boys has borne fruit in the affirmation of eternal life. In its luminous end, this novel promises that human prudence can find its perfection by participating in divine providence. Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Hibbs.
Paul, sorry to have run out and come back. I had an old version in my room here of the PowerPoint printed out, so just in case the technology continued to fail on us. All right, so I want to talk about William Everson, brother Antoninus, but I want to talk about another poet first. These are two poets there. Actually, I devote a chapter to each of them in this Notre Dame Press book, The Theology of Creation. And I'm grateful to Dana Gioia, actually, for a conversation at Baylor about 15 years ago when he was visiting, where he told me about these two poets. And years later, they ended up being part of this book that I wrote. So Jeffers, got some data here on him, known as the Poet Laureate of the Environmental Movement, a master of the sublime. Born in 1887, moves and lives most of his life in Carmel, California. A nature poet, California poet, and significantly a poet, philosopher of what he described himself as being of inhumanism. Everson's devotion, his whole life, to Jeffers' poetry can be found in his own writings. Everson was a California beat poet and then had a conversion experience at Christmas Eve Mass, I think 1948, in San Francisco. And to get to the point Greg was making earlier about transcendence and immanence, it's the smell of the Christmas tree that provokes something in him that moves his soul as previously an indifferent pantheist to take seriously the incarnation. He converts, is involved with the Catholic worker in Oakland, and then in 1951 enters the Dominican order as a lay brother, takes the name Brother Antoninus, at St. Albert's in Oakland. December 7th in California, after giving a reading, he dramatically takes off his habit and takes the hand of a woman in the audience and leaves the order. He did die reconciled to the order and is buried in the Dominican graveyard in Northern California. December 7th, for historians of the pop culture in the 1960s, the day after the infamous Altamont concert of the Rolling Stones. Let me read just a brief selection. I mentioned that Jeffers moved to Carmel. The extraordinary patience of things. This beautiful place defaced with a crop of suburban houses. How beautiful when we first beheld it. Now, I'm skipping a few lines. Now the spoiler has come. The spoiler is man. Does it care? The natural world? Not faintly. It has all time. It knows the people are a tide that swells and in time will ebb, and all their works dissolve. Meanwhile, the image of this pristine beauty lives in the very grain of the granite, safe as the endless ocean that climbs our cliff. As for us, we must uncenter our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. That theme of uncentering our minds actually sounds a little bit like Iris Murdoch in The Sovereignty of the Good, talking about strategies of unselfing. Unhumanize our views. This is the inhumanism of Jeffers, and it is a practice of poetry and of living that involves transcendence of self and indeed transcendence of all humanity in relation to the whole that is creation. Jeffers stresses, not creation, but nature for him. Jeffers stresses the infinitesimal small part that we occupy geographically in the whole, and the infinitesimally small moment of time that we occupy with respect to the whole. Jeffers said, I believe the universe is one being. All its parts are parts of one organic whole. Further down, I am compelled to love it and to think of it as divine. It seems to me that this whole alone is worthy of a deeper sort of love, and that here is peace, freedom, I might say a kind of salvation in turning one's affection outward toward this one God rather than inward. Inhumanism, he describes as a shifting of emphasis from man to not man, the rejection of human solipsism and the recognition of the transhuman magnificence. So this abnegation of self and humanity for Jeffers is, in a sense, the point of his poetry, and he describes the craft or calling of the poet here in this poem, The Beauty of Things, to feel greatly and understand greatly and express greatly the natural beauty is the sole business of poetry. I think you can say that Jeffers is a bit of an exception in 20th century poetics for focusing on beauty as the key task. The sole business of poetry, the rest is diversion. Those holy or noble sentiments, the intricate ideas, the love, lust, longing, reasons, but not the reason. There's this interesting paradox about Jeffers' own understanding of our place in the cosmos and his philosophy of his inhumanism. You might say it arises from the peculiarity of the human as having the capacity to appreciate and express this beauty. And Jeffers is pretty honest about the problem this raises for his own view. And he puts it this way: this human and in itself subjective sense of beauty is occasioned by some corresponding quality or temper or arrangement in the object. Why else should a quite neutral thing be somehow lovely and loveworthy, and become more so the more it is realized by contemplation? Human qualities, he says, I would not impute them into the objects unless there is something in not man that corresponds to these qualities in man. And here's his sort of Pascalian wager on this congruence, this odd congruence between the natural beauty of things and the capacity of human beings to appreciate it and articulate it. This may be called delusion, or it may be called mystical certainty. There is no external proof either way. Got a passage here from mid-20th century Thomist, the great Laval Thomist Charles de Connick, who was the mentor of my Notre Dame mentor, Ralph McInerney. The image of the entire cosmos as essentially ordered to man would appear grotesque from the perspective of the astronomy which provides him a poor planet born of a catastrophe. And yet de Connick takes us to the same question or issue that Jeffers does, only he's coming at it from the perspective of a believer in divine creation. If God creates, necessarily he creates in order to manifest his glory outside, not to manifest it to himself, as if by creation he could grow in his own regard. De Connick argues that creation is essentially a communication. His work must be capable of appreciating the gratuitous gift that communication is, and that is achieved in the person. That is, an intellectual creature who can give glory to his principle, or perhaps can appreciate and express the beauty of things. Then this line that I love toward the end of the cosmos: we will only be able to understand ourselves when we understand the universe. Our present is filled with the past. I want to turn now to Everson. I've got a passage here about from John Paul II, beautiful, about the incarnation Christ in the incarnation uniting himself through his flesh with the whole of creation. Everson, after he converts, the first poem that he writes is actually a rewriting, in a sense, or a reflection on Eliot's Journey of the Magi, a poem that Eliot wrote just before his own conversion. And I think you can debate that poem, I think it bears the mark of someone who's not there yet. Everson writes a poem, as Brother Antoninus, called The Triptych of the Living, the last section of which is about the Magi. The first section is called The Uncouth. It's about the shepherds living locally in the spot where Christ is born. The second section is called The Coming, actually the birth of Christ. I want to read this section from Antoninus and then talk about what I take to be the element of transcendence, or the particular teaching on transcendence that you can find in it. Quote from Scripture, "Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he?' Miles across," and those of you who know the Eliot poem will note the similarities here. "Miles across the turbulent kingdoms they came for it, but that was nothing. That was the least, drunk with vision, rain stringing the ragged beards. When a beast lamed, they caught up another and goaded west. For the time was on them, once as it may in the life of a man, once as it was in the life of mankind. All is corrected. And the years of pursuit, raw-eyed reading the wrong texts, charting the doubtful calculations, those nights knotted with thought, when dawn held off and the rooster rattled the leaves with his blind assertion. All that they regarded under the sign, that is, after they have encountered the Christ child, no longer as search, but as preparation. For when the mark was made, they saw it, nor stopped to reckon the fallible years, but rejoiced and followed. And are called wise, who learned that truth, when sought and at last seen, is never found, is given." I think this is a beautiful, short poem, particularly this section that I've just read. Transcendence through the recognition of that which is present in our midst to our senses as gift. That's the importance of regarding it no longer as search, but as preparation, and no longer as found, but as given. Why is that? It's because what they receive is wholly disproportionate to any antecedent expectation that they had, or any antecedent effort that they exerted to find what they were looking for. So this notion of seeking and finding, but that which is found exceeding every antecedent expectation, brings us into the realm of the encounter of transcendence through the gift, where something utterly beyond us is manifest in our midst. To go back to what Greg was saying at the very beginning, this is not a transcendence as escape. It's not a transcendence as abnegation of the self or the human into the pantheistic whole. Instead, it is an encounter in our very midst with something that is so marvelous, so miraculous, so astonishingly beyond anything that we could have wished or hoped for, that we can only receive it as a gift from that which transcends what is given. It's a beautiful reflection, I think, on the logic of the gift. Another way in which Everson leads us through his poetry, or Antoninus, I should say, leads us through his poetry to an encounter with transcendence in the midst of our experience, is by, in a sense, rewriting Jeffers' various reflections upon nature and the whole. This is a poem that seems to me to be very close to a number of poems from Hopkins, particularly perhaps Pied Beauty. Let me just read a little bit of this, and then I'll make a couple closing comments and we can go to questions. Salt Creek mouths unflushed by the sea in the long day shuts down. Whose hand stacks rock, cairn-posted, churched to the folded soul of this hill, and whose mind conceives? Go to the bottom. God makes on earth, in us, most instantly, on the very now. His own means conceives. How many strengths break out unchoked where he, whom all declares, delights to make be. The Creator God must be absent. Unlike the pantheistic God, who is fully present, the Creator God must be, in some sense, absent, being distinct from, transcendent above the whole of the created order. What Antoninus is doing here with this poetry is in the midst of 20th century nature poetry in California, in the midst of 20th century beat poetry. He is attempting to recapture the language of creation as sign and to reinvigorate in us an appreciation of the manifold complexity and beauty of all created things as signs of the God who makes and who is declared to be by all the things that are made. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Hibbs. All right, we have about 9 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, please raise your hand.
So I have a question primarily about Piranesi, but it somewhat leads over, I suppose, into their presentation as well. One of the refrains of the narrator of Piranesi is that the sort of beauty of the house is immeasurable and its kindness is infinite. And the house becomes to him, I think he uses the language of wholeness. The house is whole unto itself and sort of worshipful unto itself. I'm wondering, does that kind of worship of the house factor into your reading of the novel? Does this impinge on pantheism in any way, or does it fit within the kind of sort of describes immanence that you want to talk about?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, it's a lovely line that's repeated a couple times in the novel, as you said. The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. And you're right. You could say that by speaking of the house as such, and not God or a giver or an external being, house might lend you to some sense that, well, maybe there's some pantheism going on here. But I think that would be an excessively rigoristic kind of reading. I think the house is the metaphor really for the world, and not to worship it, but to receive it. That the world is essentially gift. It's given. And there's an active relationship. It's not inert. It's not passive. It is participated. Reality is participated, not reality is observed, described, manipulated, controlled. All these different approaches get their hearing in the narrative, but reality as participated, reality as the garment, I think implies a giver, implies, as Brother Antoninus would say, a kind of inhumanism that implies a superhumanism. And I think it's also her attempt to maybe shy away from the easily allegorical, to not really give it away quite so directly. But yeah, I suppose there's a little tension there, but I'm confident that she's, in a sense, orthodox on that point. And interestingly enough, even though she lives in Derbyshire now, she was living in Cambridge for quite a while, and she became a regular congregant at the Church of St. Clement's, where Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury and later Master of Magdalen College, was a preacher. And Rowan himself has told me that she was very much a kind of luminous presence in the congregation. So it's an excellent question.
Hi, my name is Lauren Rubey. Thanks so much for all your presentations. Just kind of building on that, I have a question on that first transcendent comment that you made, Mr. Wolfe, and kind of your issue with the word, and I'm wondering if what Professor Hibbs said about pulling from the poetry of the wise kind of changes your perspective on that, or you commented on that and touched on that too, but especially related to what you just said on seeing the world as a gift. How does that relate to kind of your issue in rising above and seeing that unrelated to the material sacramental?
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern I have about transcendence is a kind of second-rate Platonism, a kind of elsewhere that's not here, is that it's sort of a deus ex machina. It's sort of transcendence as last-minute sort of covering up of a conundrum that really needs to be solved in a more forthright manner, as a kind of Band-Aid over the wound of our anxiety about experiencing grace, experiencing the divine. So I would just say, I'm obviously being combative and playful a little bit when I'm attacking transcendence, but it's just more or less, to quote Paul, I'm trying to be prudent. As an act of prudence, I'm trying to avoid a kind of excess. I'm trying for a golden mean here. If we want transcendence, let's understand it as transcendence through immanence. You might say no grace except through nature. The grace comes to us through the created order, through our senses, through the messiness of the world. It doesn't come as a deus ex machina that sort of somehow rescues a kind of catastrophic problem that we can't solve.
Time for, let's just take both of these questions now, and then you first.
This is for Tom. Thank you so much for your reading of Everson. I'm convinced you're right. It was a conversation with Eliot, the Magi. Can you talk a little bit more about the end of the poem and maybe how it contrasts the dissatisfaction felt by Eliot's Magi when they go back to the old dispensation? And kind of link that to what you're saying about your role in nature and how to receive this.
Yeah, I think and I didn't read the very last part of the poem, but it's the Magi ends with them at home in the old dispensation, a different dispensation from the Jewish dispensation, but an old dispensation, and it ends with, "I would be glad of another death." And as is true throughout that poem, there are all sorts of allusions to scripture that the narrator doesn't seem to fully understand. And I see Eliot as still embodying there the kind of modern consciousness which is no longer at home in an older world because of the Christian revelation, but can't quite work himself into the Christian revelation. So that the alienation is being caught betwixt and between and at home nowhere. The Magi in Everson's poem at the end are on their knees, weeping and praising. So they have been fully converted, just as Everson had not long before he wrote the poem, and had been embodying something like that modern alienated consciousness that Eliot himself lived and reflected in his poetry. I think it's quite clear that he intends that ending to be much more emphatically both cognitive in assent and emotive and passionate in the unity with the Christ child.
All right. We have 1 minute left. You still have a question, sir?
Sure, thank you. Probably can't be covered in a minute, but just for both the first and last speaker, and it's a theme you hear a lot, it's this idea that there's a contrast between kind of a scientific, technical, mastery-based way of looking at things and this kind of older, more participative way of looking at things. My sort of question is, how are we to sort of think of science? I mean, people often say, the scientific revolution happened. We're all beneficiaries of the scientific revolution. People often sort of try and half put the genie back into the bottle. They kind of go, well, we just have to think about it kind of differently. But isn't the whole idea that it was this big material transformation of everything that came with the scientific revolution? And I just sort of wonder how, in a sort of a post-scientific age, are you supposed to actually get back to that participative way of being without actually being skeptical of the whole project of modern science?
It's a great question. I'll just say that the one thing I didn't really have time to get into is that Barfield takes all this into account, and he actually says, he critiques the scientific mentality in the sense of what he calls, he says you could put a very clever boy in a car, and he could eventually figure out how to work the car. He calls that dashboard knowledge. But understanding how the car works and where the car came from is something beyond which the clever boy could understand. So in a sense, he's just trying to contextualize science in terms of its proper place, not that, and not become scientism. Scientism is a kind of assumption of kind of usurpation of metaphysics by science, trying to be something, a category that it's not qualified to be. But the whole thing I didn't get a chance to say is that Barfield says, no, there is no way of putting the genie back in the bottle. There's no way to go back to original participation. What we should aim for, he says, is final participation. And final participation involves an act of imagination, what he calls directionally creator relation. It's a bit of an awkward phrase, but he cites the Romantics. He was a great student of Coleridge. And Coleridge's idea of the primary imagination and the secondary imagination. And so and you can see how people like Clarke and Lewis and Williams are trying to, in a sense, bring us through the act of imagination into not a naivete, but a kind of a both and. Again, to go back to what Paul was saying, and which is quintessentially Catholic, right? To say both and rather than either or. And so I think any proper reading of Barfield really has to wrestle with his belief that final participation is not a running away, but it's the next stage, you might say, in evolution. I haven't done it justice, but I think it's really worth investigating. And Saving the Appearances is a tricky book. It's sometimes a little hard to grasp, but just so rewarding if you spend a little time with it.